Today's parts 1 and 2 with the part 0 homework due tonight. We have 3 days to work on this module. It's relatively short compared to most. And then our next exam is next week, Tuesday. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the materials for this particular module. Like I said, Module 6 is about orange juice sales and prices. And essentially what's happening in this module is we have all this data where a bunch of our stores, apparently we have 83 stores, have been selling OJ at different prices, trying to find the price that maximizes profit because they can raise the price, but then the amount they sell typically goes down. So they want to find like where's the balance that creates the optimal uh, profit for this scenario. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this particular module. The spreadsheet looks something like this. And unlike most of our modules this semester, this spreadsheet is nearly entirely built. We are going to add some stuff next time, but at least for today, it's pretty much already built. And our primary goal is simply trying to understand what's going on this spreadsheet because there's already so much here. We just want to understand how to use this and read it essentially. So let's take a look at this. We have some stuff up here that I'll come back to and describe in a second. But what's going on down here is sort of like our raw data. So like at each of our stores, we wrote down what brand we were selling, what week it was, what price we tried, how much we sold. And then we graph those things. So those blue dots are representing the raw data. They're a little bit all over the place because, you know, just because you have the same price each week doesn't mean you're necessarily going to sell the same amount. Next thing I want to point out is if you look at this section of your spreadsheet, you got these little buttons at the top of each column. And this is because a filter has been added to the raw data. And this is one of the primary tools that we'll be using to analyze this data. We want to be able to filter down to just a single like store brand pair just to see what happened in that one case and compare it to other cases. And if you want, you can make your own filter by going to the Home tab, going to this Sort and Filter button, then using Filter. That'll make the things go away. Same process makes them appear. So if you ever want to add your own, that's how it works. And then you can hit these buttons to utilize the filter. So let's see how this works. So first thing I want to point out is that when you're looking at these buttons on the spreadsheet that was hopefully emailed to you yesterday, you'll notice that these first two pictures, these buttons off to the side of the words, are different than these. And that's because these two particular columns are the ones being filtered. And you can verify that by clicking on the button and see that, oh yeah, I'm only looking at store 5 or I'm only looking at Tropicana in this instance, as opposed to like your weeks, that's completely unfiltered. I'm looking at all of them at the moment. And the way you use this filter is very simple. You just, click on the one you want and it displays that particular set of data. The reason I wanted to point out these little pictures here though, is because it's really useful to notice this in case you're working on later questions and then maybe you add a filter to week later on and then you go back and notice, oh, my data is missing some information. I'm getting the wrong answer. Well, that's because you potentially, I'll just do that really quick. It's because you potentially didn't take this filter off. And this picture next to the word week is sort of reminding you, oh, you might want to take that off as you proceed to the next question, because maybe the next question wants all the information, not just some of it. So rely on that little picture just as a reminder. Next thing I want to point out is how filters work. Notice along the left side of my screen how these rows go from 21 to 352. That's because the way filters work is they don't sort of get rid of the data temporarily. They just hide the rows. So they almost shrink them out of sight but they're still there. Like if I take off these filters, then we go back to seeing all of the rows. If I go all the way down, there's apparently 28,000 some odd lines of data. But when I add these filters on, I only have rows 352 to 467. So it's just hiding the other ones. They're still there. So let's say we want to try a different problem and we only want to look at stores 8 and 50. Now, one thing I want to point out is this select all button at the top is really useful because let's say you were starting with that. You don't want to have to go through and deselect all of these. Oops, I want that one at a time. You just want to quickly deselect everything. Okay, I want 8. I want 50. There we go. I can scroll down and there's 8 and 50. Those are the only things being displayed. So that select all button, very useful for deselecting stuff. Okay, here's another example really quick. Let's go to store 9. So I click store 8. I hit store 9. Oh, I'm great. I did the filter. I'm gonna look at my answer. Well, I actually did a mistake on purpose. I did not deselect 50 when I did that. And I forgot because I didn't scroll all the way down and notice there was a check down here and deselect it. So typically when you're changing questions, you're going from one store to the next, it's always safe to hit select all once and then twice, and then you know everything below, even the ones you can't see down here, they've been deselected. So it's a good sort of practice to use that button when you are utilizing the filter. Next thing I want to point out is let's say you do some work in Excel and we build this nice graph over here. This graph's already given to you, but let's say you build another one. It's over here. And then you go to the next question. Next question's about store 8. You change your filter. Oh no, my graph's gone. Well, it's not actually gone. Remember how filters work? They're just hiding your rows. So the graph is still there. It's just in another row that you currently can't see. So what I would advise doing is in this particular module, either keep all your work up here or put it on another tab if you want it to be always present. Now, if there's some work that you only want next to store 8, then it's fine to do over here because then it'll disappear, when you go to the next question. But if you want some work that is for any set of data, it's safer to do up at the top because then you don't have to, go hunt it down and find the row that it's hidden in. Next thing I want to point out is this graph that was already built for you interacts very well with filters. If I change my store 5 to 8, watch what happens to the graph. It automatically redraws itself only using the visible data down here in the filter. So it doesn't graph the hidden rows, which is really nice because otherwise there's like 30,000 points in this graph. On the other hand, functions do not work out very well with filters. They do not behave how you would like them to. Let's say I use the sum function on these 4 numbers. Okay, I'm adding up 4 numbers. I expect to get, 12-ish, but I got 700. What happened? Well, the sum function can see all those invisible rows between, look at my formula, 21 to 355. So it's still adding those numbers up. So just be aware of that. Be careful when you use functions because they will count the invisible cells. And so when you're highlighting things, make sure you're only highlighting the ones you want. There is one exception to this rule, and that's this guy. It's called subtotal. It's already built in your spreadsheet. You do not need to know how to use it, but you do need to know what this represents. And that's one of our goals today in part 2. The questions in the workbook sort of guide you there. Okay, let's talk about some of the workbook questions because they're a little bit weird. So in part 1, it starts off really straightforward. It's asking about correlation. So you're using that correl function from way back when. And then it asks you to change to Minute Maid. So you change your filter and you do it again. really nothing hard there. The scatter plot's already built. Remember, you just have to change the filter. You're done. So that's two different Corel functions you have to use. Essentially done with part one. Just be careful that you're only highlighting the rows you want and you don't accidentally grab some of the invisible rows. Okay, in part two, there's a couple questions though I do want to talk about because they're a little bit weird. The first question says, find the equation of this red line. And you might think, oh, well, that's the red line on my spreadsheet, but it's actually not. The red line, I can't display these both at the same time, but the red line in the spreadsheet is not the one that they're asking you about on the workbook. And the reason why is this red line, as I'll show you in a second, is completely movable. And if I, slide this up, it shifts completely. So that red line, we're going to be constantly moving. The first question in part two is asking specifically about this line. And in order to get the equation of a line, you need 2 points. Gives you one there. You can actually see a second one right there, but you don't know what the X and Y coordinates are. So I want to show you a little trick you can use. Notice that if I go from this tall point and I go down twice, I can find it. So if you go to Excel and you go to this tall point and down twice, I colored it orange just to make it easier to find. If you highlight it, or if you hover over it rather with your mouse, it'll display the X and Y coordinate. So that's how you're supposed to answer the first question in part one. Don't use this guy, this red line. It's different than the one in the book. So just find this point, hover over it, use that as your second XY pair. Okay, what else are we doing in part two? Well, the rest, whoops, that's not what I wanted. The rest of part two has to do with learning what's going on in this top left corner of the spreadsheet. And it sort of guides you through how you're going to be changing that red line in order to find the best line. What do I mean by that? Well, the idea is that if I have this raw data, if I have like all these points just recorded from different sales, there is some line, and I don't even know if it's one of these, there's some line that sort of slices through them the best. And it's called the line of best fit. And the reason we want to find that line is because it'd be very useful, because I can say, well, according to this pattern of these dots, if I follow this line, I can see that if I sell my orange juice for $1, I can expect to sell this many units. And that is extremely valuable information, because then I don't have to go to my 80 stores and say, hey, go sell orange juice for $1 for a couple of weeks. I want to see what happens. I can just use this orange line, which is a model that's estimating what would happen, and try to figure it out. So if I can find the best line that fits the pattern the best, in other words, it's as close to the points as possible, this would be extremely valuable information, because I could model this behavior. So what we're doing over here on the right is we're trying out different lines until we can find the best line. And the part two sort of guides you through what it means to be the best. Now, in the very last question in part two, it's the last thing I want to talk about, it mentions a brand new tool in Excel called Solver. And these are the notes I sent you this morning. So Solver is super useful for doing the following. Let's say I have this graph here and I want to figure out where it bottoms out. Well, I could guess. I could use, guess and check to sort of figure it out. Or I could use a brand new tool called Solver to find the exact point. You might think, well, why not just use GoalSeek? Well, you would have to know what this value is in order to plug it into GoalSeek. I don't know what the smallest Y value is. So we need a new tool. That new tool is called Solver. And just like with GoalSeek, we have to do a little bit of setup first before we can get this to run. I'm going to do the Windows setup first because it's super awkward. And I'll show you the one for Apple. It's a lot simpler. But for Windows, we're going to go to File, Options, and then down in the bottom left, look for Add-ins, and this button here that says Go. And last of all, make sure there's a check next to Solver. If you do that correctly, on the Data tab, kind of like What If Analysis, all the way to the right, we have this tool called Solver. On Apple, it's a little easier. You go to the top drop-down menu, you go to Tools, Add-ins, put a check next to Solver. And that should hopefully make that button appear. If it doesn't, I can help you out a little bit more. But anyway, if we can run Solver, I can find this exact point. But let's actually do a more complicated example. I'm gonna go to my next tab and show you one that's slightly more annoying and even harder to use. Let's say I have 2 inputs. So I have some crazy calculator where as I change these numbers over on the left, the number on the right changes. So this is kind of like the last question where I'm still trying to minimize this, just like I was minimizing this guy. I just don't have a graph this time because it's 3-dimensional, which is hard to make in Excel. And so again, I want to make this cell as small as possible. Now, still, guess and check still works, but it's significantly harder, right? Because now I have to like find the best number for 2 cells. Well, once again, goal-seek is not really the answer here. Solver is what we want. So what I want to do is follow these steps here to essentially make this number as small as possible. So I click on this 14 that I would like to be really small, and I go up to that brand new button we have called Solver. Now, inside this, we need a few different things. The objective cell is this guy, the one I would like to be really small. This next line, I can either maximize it, minimize it, or set it to a value. Set it to a value is what goal-seek does. I don't know what that value is, so I'm going to hit minimize. By changing, this is where like usually the last step of goal-seek is where's your 1 input cell. Well, where goal-seek can have 1, Solver can have more than 1, which is very nice. So I'm going to highlight both of these guys. And last step, I want to make sure this little box down here is not checked. So I deselect that box. I hit solve. Right now, this box is 14. After I hit solve, it says it found a solution. I hit OK, and oh, look, it's -2. That's as small as it's going to get. I didn't have to do any crazy guess and check. Solver found it for me, which is extremely nice. So this principle of minimizing something is going to come in to be very useful when you're finding that line of best fit that's going to model the behavior of our sales. And as you go through part 2, it'll sort of explain why. But if it doesn't make sense, we'll talk about it more next time as well. So that's technically the last question in part 2. So you don't need Solver until then. But yeah, try to go through all the steps in part 2 to see actually why you're doing it. And if it's confusing, just let me know.